Hello, welcome everybody, and thank you for attending this event about boosting development effectiveness with adaptive management, organized by the IDB's Office of Evaluation and Oversight. Before we start, a little bit on logistics. You can write your questions in the Q&A chat, and we are having live interpretation to Spanish and Portuguese. You can use the world icon to find the interpretation of your preference. I want to pass the floor to Marialisa Motta, our Oversight Director, who will give a welcoming and introductory remarks. Welcome, Marialisa.
Thank you, Claudia. Many thanks, and it is my pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to give some introductory remarks to this very important session. A special welcome and thank you to the panelists and also to all colleagues who are joining us from various regions. Achieving development outcomes, lifting out of poverty more than 700 million people who now live on about $2 a day in the world, and reducing income inequalities within countries and across countries, just to mention two of the Sustainable Development Goals that the development community has committed to achieve by 2030, is a very ambitious and highly complex endeavor. It requires, among other things, that multilateral development banks have a clear vision, clear strategy, raise more capital from the private sector and leverage it much more than they're currently doing, and also that they have great implementation capacity. Now, underlying all of this, the vision, the strategy, also establishing partnerships, and very importantly, implementing activities well, is the ability to continuously learn and quickly adjust the course of action, which is what adaptive management is about. Now, I have experienced firsthand the importance of adaptive management, learning from my own failures and some successes. When I first started working in development, it was more than 20 years ago, I designed a project for a country in Latin America that had as a key objective that of improving competition in the country. That means reducing barriers so that private companies can come into various sectors and then produce more products, and the prices go down, consumers benefit, particularly including and sometimes particularly low-income people. And what happened 4 months after project approval is that the country had already a best practice antitrust law in parliament and the embryo of a competition policy agency ready to start working. That was great success. It was very quick. And indeed, at closure, 7-8 years after, the project was evaluated and the competition part was rated successfully. Now, shortly after completing the design of the project, I moved to another region. It so happens, and I started working somewhere else. I returned to Latin America after 10 years, and I returned to realize that the level of competition in the country where I had designed a project that was implemented in the past 7-8 years was very low, was actually one of the worst in Latin America. If I remember correctly, it was second to last. And we could measure these well thanks to new indicators that the OECD had developed, the pro-market regulation indicators that we jointly started to collect with the OECD in Latin America and also in the Middle East. So what we realized based on this data is that several sectors in that country had barriers to entry, that fewer products were available compared to neighboring countries, and the prices were much higher, including prices such as fertilizer, for example, which are very important for farmers, including micro farmers. So something had gone wrong. What I thought was very successful, I realized 10 years after, it actually didn't work. And this is my example of failure of adaptive management. And as I look back, the failure was due to several factors, including the fact that at the time of design, we established objectives and indicators that were focused on intermediary outcomes, so the passing of the law, the creation of the agency, rather than impact. The lack of impact data, really, when we designed the project was another issue, but also the fact that when the data became available after 4 or 5 years, they were not reflected in the project. And then also the lack of institutional incentives. As I moved to another region, I didn't have much focus on what was happening there. It's only when I returned 10 years after that I started looking at what happened and what went wrong. Granted, we did realize 10 years after that we had to change our approach to competition, and we did. And we focused much more starting at that point on reducing barriers to enter sectors. Many of them are simply administrative barriers rather than passing laws and strengthening the agency. So at that point, things started to change, and we applied that approach not only in that country, but more broadly in the region and in other regions as well. So we did learn and we did adapt, and we saw positive changes, but after more than a decade. Now, I also had the good fortune of experiencing some successes and the positive consequences of adaptive management, particularly at the time when I restructured projects. And that means changing the objectives, project indicators, reallocating project money from one activity to another when it becomes clear that where you're putting money is not likely to lead to outcomes, particularly, again, if new evidence becomes available, like new data, like it happened on competition in that country. And being able to do all of this while the project is under implementation, changing indicators, objectives, moving money across, makes a difference in achieving meaningful development outcomes in few months or few years, rather than more than a decade. And if you think about our commitments, lifting 700 million people out of extreme poverty, 28 million people just in Latin America and the Caribbean, by 2030, that's in 6 years. We don't have 10 years to learn lessons and adapt. We need to act much more quickly. And evaluation has a key role to play in helping management be relevant and quick on its feet. Focus on development outcomes, change course of actions based on new evidence, change monitoring and evaluation systems when needed, as they also need to be adaptive. And this is what today's panel will discuss. Now, it's my pleasure and my honor to give the floor back to Claudia and Mariana, Claudia Figueroa and Mariana Gamarra. Claudia is an evaluation specialist in OVE, and she has worked on several evaluations, country, sector, corporate, and Mariana is a research fellow who is now with OVE, but has experience both in evaluation and in policy with the OECD and UNESCO. I have to apologize, I won't be able to stay for the panel, but I wish you all the best on what seems to be a very rich discussion and great presentations. And I will make sure I ask Claudia and Mariana for key insights that are coming out of this session, because I really think it's important that we continue to focus on this and we learn and we take it forward and we implement whatever lessons come out, knowledge, panel, exchanges of knowledge such as this one. Thanks to all.
Thank you, Marialisa, for sharing those very concrete examples that remind us that ultimately what matters is whether we are helping our counterparts to achieve meaningful outcomes on the ground, and that our procedures, tools, and metrics should go to that direction. Let me introduce now the distinguished panel of experts that is joining us today, who bring diverse expertise and offer insights from research, implementation, and innovative evaluation to enhance outcome orientation. Dr. Estelle Raimondo, she is head of methods at the World Bank's Independent Evaluation Group. She is an internationally recognized expert on evaluation methodologies, has advised governments and international organizations on evaluation system, and has published extensively on the topic. Welcome, Estelle. Leni Wild, she is Deputy Director at Global Partners Governance, leading on research, M&E, and strategic communications. She has over 20 years of experience and is recognized in political analysis and a leader in adaptive management, among many other topics. Welcome, Leni. And Søren works at the UNDP, focusing on transnational corruption, financial integrity, and innovation. Søren has also led UNDP's M&E Sandbox, Rethinking Monitoring, Evaluation, and Impact Measurement for Contemporary Challenges. Welcome, Søren. Today, we will discuss adaptive management, what is it, why it is relevant, how it can be done rigorously, and the implications for monitoring and evaluation and beyond. This is an important topic as development interventions typically occur in complex and dynamic environments that require proactive approaches to maintain a real focus on results. So let's start with our first question. What is adaptive management and why it is relevant to achieving results? Leni, can you give us an overview of what this concept means?
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you very much for the invite to participate today. And it's great to be part of such an excellent panel. So I'm looking forward to our discussion today. I should say I am a researcher, an analyst. I've worked for think tanks. I currently work for a small organization that supports capacity building for political institutions. So I'm not from a funding organization, a lending institution, a different background. But what I would say is I think the first thing we have to recognize when thinking about adaptive management is that it is not new. I'd say arguably it's been around for as long as development, practice and thinking has been around. In the 1960s, people like Hirschman were talking about it. Then in the late 80s, early 1990s, there were calls for more structured flexibility in development. And I think consistent evaluations and research have shown over many decades that development projects too often do not learn from their experiences and do not change based on what is learned. And Marialisa gave us a very excellent example from her experience of that as well. Adaptive management borrows also from the experience in lots of other fields, from kind of business management and practices, military strategy, natural sciences. It's a sort of amalgamation of the principles that have emerged from lots of different types of large organizations trying to deliver difficult things. And there's lots of different definitions out there, but the one that I quite like is the definition used by USAID, which describes adaptive management as an intentional approach to making decisions and adjustments in response to new information and changes in context. So I like the fact that it talks about being intentional about learning and adjusting, but also that what you're doing is you have your goal in mind, and what you're adapting is the understanding of how to get there. It's not necessarily changing the end outcomes, it's learning about how to achieve them. And I think adaptive management is an approach that inherently recognizes the complexity that exists in almost all change processes, which I think is ultimately what development is about. It's about supporting changes in systems, in behaviors, in outcomes, ultimately, some of which, again, Marialisa talked about in terms of the big development goals that exist. You know, none of these things can we easily predict how to achieve them in advance. So approaches that are based on intentional testing and learning are much more appropriate when you're dealing with complexity, uncertainty, behavior change, lots of different actors, organizations that need to come together to support an outcome. So I think it can and it should offer a better approach for substantively realizing results. I think it's interesting that it's often seen, and I often hear criticisms, that it's a more risky proposition. But I think if we're thinking about decisions on how to lend or how to spend limited resources, I think we need to be really open that blueprint planning or approaches that assume a certain level of certainty in terms of how things can be planned, delivered and achieved up front is not low risk, and actually has contributed and regularly contributes to a lot of costly failures. So, you know, for me, adaptive management is not about figuring out as you go. It means starting with some initial hypotheses. How do you think something's going to change or reform will be achieved? Testing those, revising them as you're doing something, using the best available information that you have at the time, having those regular feedback loops and actually acting on them as part of implementation. And I think it's also helpful because it has to be very context specific. it means you have to really figure out what is going to work in a particular context, environment, situation, and why through that testing and iteration process. So I guess for me, the ideas of adaptive management now seem to be fairly well established. A whole range of different types of organizations in development, whether they're funders, lenders, implementers, partners, increasingly are using the rhetoric or have policy commitments around adaptive management. I think the problem we have now is the reality of big gaps in actual implementation. Are we doing what we said we were going to do here? The reality is lots of large bureaucracies of different kinds still have very low tolerance for experimentation, for really putting learning at the center. So I think there are real questions, not only about what is adaptive management, but why aren't we doing it when we say we should and are? Maybe I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you, Leni, for this very clear explanation that help us understand that this concept is not like a high-level theoretical idea, but a very concrete, practical approach that is context-specific and that has been around for a long time, that requires being intentional on testing and learning to make decisions in depth. Estelle, what does adaptive management look like at the level of country engagements at the World Bank Group?
Thank you, Claudia, for this question, and to Leni for really giving us a really nice framework to work on. And maybe a couple of things at the outset so that our participants understand, on what basis I will be talking. So in 2020, we led an evaluation of the bank group's outcome orientation at the country level. And so the idea was really to try to understand, how the bank group as a whole, with a very country-centric model, aims for outcomes, how it captures those outcomes, how it measures, how it understands and learns, and how it manages for outcomes. And so this last part was very much about understanding whether teams are practicing adaptive management, and above all, whether the systems that we have in place, these results-based systems, are enabling or hindering them in doing so. So that's kind of the framework within which I will talk today. And so, as Leni highlighted, of course, adaptive management is not new. There has been quite a lot of science of delivery and understanding, how things work, but mostly at the project level or within a particular intervention. There hasn't been as much reflection on what it means to be adaptive at the country level. How do you manage a portfolio of interventions? How do you manage a country engagement adaptively? How do you learn from both the lending, but also many of our institutions are doing a lot of advisory work, training, capacity building, institutional development. And so understanding how the sum of the parts work together and how to adapt that in context. So the evaluation tried to really be steeped in the literature, but also adapt some of these concepts and understand what are the decisions that are being made around this country program, this country portfolio, and what are the opportunities for being adaptive. So just to put things quite concretely, country teams, the types of decisions that they have to deal with are about, establishing or managing a pipeline of operation, approving or not approving new interventions, new projects, how to restructure within a sector or within one intervention, how to determine whether government reforms are mature enough to be able, for instance, to go for policy lending, policy financing, deciding which pieces or portfolio of analytical work is needed to support operations and lending within sectors, and then sometimes reallocating resources across different parts of the portfolio. So these are the kinds of decisions that need to also be informed by a pursuit for outcome and understanding a little bit more of a country program approach. So what did we find in this evaluation on the practice of adaptive management in the bank group, in the World Bank Group, at this level? What we found that country teams very much practice several aspects of adaptive management, but not all. So they tend to very closely monitor the health of the portfolios, focusing on some clear metrics, disbursements, trying to really work through the delivery issues that are happening, and also navigating changes in context, including changes in political economy. So there is a real systematic effort on the delivery side, right? Driven by disbursements, by delivery issues. At the same time, it was very clear from the evaluation that we did and a lot of feedback we got from country teams is that they recognized that this was not sufficient. It was not the whole set of adaptive management decisions that they needed to make. And often it was difficult to actually adapt based on new evidence of what works and what doesn't work and why, and this testing hypothesis that Leni kind of laid out at the beginning. And so there was a disproportionate emphasis on these metrics of disbursements, of output delivery, and not sufficiently on understanding whether progress was being made along complex results chain. So the major second takeaway was that these adaptive behaviors were not supported by the result systems that were in place at the bank group. These, and I can go into it a little bit later, what were these limitations. But I guess the big conclusion is that these result systems had been set up, as Leni said, many years ago. At the project level, it's in the 60s. At the country level, it was in the 90s. And they have had their path dependency, right? So it has been actually extremely difficult to change these systems, despite multiple diagnostics that they were not fully supporting adaptive management, and sometimes they were actually coming in the way of it, so being an obstacle to these adaptive management practices. Let me stop here for now, and we can elaborate a little bit later.
Thank you very much, Estelle, for these very concrete examples of what adaptive management looked like at the country level and the type of decisions that implies in terms of managing the portfolio or deciding on approvals. And the issue that you present, that result systems should help, but in the end are kind of being an obstacle for adaptive management is something very interesting, and that we will come back to that. So Søren, what can you tell us in terms of in which context, like when this adaptive management approach makes sense?
Yeah, thank you, Claudia, and such a pleasure to be on this panel and discuss these important issues. Also, really great point that it was raised just now about adaptation at a portfolio level. If we have constellations of projects that are synergetic, if we adapt one that is relevant for others. So I think that's maybe a different discussion, but I think a really interesting point there. I think in terms of when it makes sense to use this approach, first of all, as I think Leni was also talking about, it's course correction. This is not new, and I think course correction should be part of any good project management, regardless of what you do, right? You need to be able to adapt. If you're building a house and your contractor is arrested for fraud, then maybe you need to change contractor, right? But I think generally it makes sense to use, at least in my perspective, adaptive management, especially if you deal with complex problems. So we can make distinctions between simple, complicated, complex, or chaotic problems. And if we're dealing with a fairly simple project like or problem like building a house or maybe even building a hospital, that might be a complicated thing, but transforming a health system is a complex challenge, and the more complexity we deal with, the more important it is that we're able to continuously learn and adapt. Similarly, I think the context or environment that we work in is really important. If there's a high degree of uncertainty in the operating environment, let's say we're working in a crisis context, whether it's Sudan or Haiti or Ukraine or elsewhere, that requires everyone to be much more agile and able to adapt as unpredictable things happen. So I think under these circumstances, this is a particularly important approach to be practicing. I I think there are also some other things that affect the when it makes sense or to do it, at least affect whether we're able to practice this type of approach. We can talk about the sort of wider enabling environment for this. There are certain types of skills that are really important to have in a program or project or organization or whoever is deploying the adaptive management approach. We need to be able to continuously learn, like skills like sense making and so on are important. Certain mindsets that people are open to actually learning and changing their minds and having a growth mindset is important to be developing and fostering that culture of learning. Having certain program governance processes and IT systems that allow for this. We just heard from Estelle that, you know, sometimes our existing systems don't necessarily allow for this, so they might even disincentivize it. So our IT systems, for instance, or finance systems, do they allow us to move funds from one activity to another? So there's those types of things that are really important to make sure are in place. Similarly, flexibility in terms of our partners and funders. Is there willingness on behalf of a funder to, or whoever we're accountable towards, to actually allow for adaptation, to maybe make changes to a lock frame, or maybe not have a lock frame? And do we have an authority to adapt and make decisions that they need to be made? Who has that type of authority, and how do we make sure that they are then give the information they need to make decisions and adapt? So those are some of the extra things I would bring into the equation when we talk about when it makes sense to apply this approach.
Thank you very much, Søren, for explaining that. While this approach can be very useful, it's also not like the panacea or the answer to everything. And that we need to identify those cases that require this approach, especially as you were saying, cases of complex interventions or cases where there is a lot of uncertainty, and have in mind as well the conditions from the funders, like if this flexibility is something that is kind of appropriate or allowed. Now that we know better about the what and why and when of adaptive management, let's move to a discussion that I think it's even harder about the how. How can adaptive management be done, and specifically, how can we do this rigorously? I'll start with Leni again, but I'll promise for next questions we will switch. Leni, can you explain what would be rigor in this context?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, there is the common concerns I mentioned, I often hear about adaptive management is that, you know, is it just sort of making things up as you go along, not having a plan, not knowing what you're doing, not knowing what's going to happen? But I think, again, adaptive approaches can undoubtedly be rigorous. Indeed, they, you know, if you like, they kind of bake into themselves the incentives to actually collect and use evidence and data from the start. But we do need to think about what rigor means, I think, in some different ways, which is what I want to comment on. I think at the same time, we also need to recognise, you know, that part of the problem here, I think, is that in reality, adaptation is happening all the time at multiple levels, but often it's happening under the radar. It's not captured in our reporting systems. It's often based on, you know, the very well-informed, but the informal and tacit knowledge that people have at multiple levels, and therefore how that shapes their decision-making. And that means it remains somewhat hidden. And I think that's why it's often challenging for when you're looking at this kind of way of working. It can sometimes still be quite weak in actually really capturing and sharing and being transparent about the sort of underlying rationale for how decisions were taken, you know, why funding choices were made, and what learning has happened. So I think that's part of the conundrum that we face here. So to me, if we're thinking about adaptive rigor and what that looks like, it's about having a more documented and transparent trail of the intentions, the decisions, and the actions that have been taken. it's making explicit what is often implicit in terms of the judgments people are constantly making that influence their decision making. So it means that you can clearly sort of show how those initial, hypotheses, why you thought you'd do something, why you thought change would happen in a certain way, the assumptions that sit beneath those, why you thought that, how you tested that, and what you did as a result of what you learned. So I think it's that kind of being more transparent and getting better at documenting that decision-making process, and the evidence that you're using as part of that is the key element for me of adaptive rigor. It means being very upfront about the appropriate collection of timely data that can inform decision-making on an ongoing basis. Again, there can often be concerns here. This could be very burdensome or can be collected too late. I think it requires often much more ongoing, regular, sometimes light touch assessments of what's happening, but combined crucially with longer term, more in-depth assessments of those deeper change processes that you're aiming at. So it's not just about short-term rapid data collection, it's a combination, I think, of different timeframes. And I think crucially for me, it's about having, as I said, very clear and transparent processes for how you have those regular kind of reflection points where you interrogate data. Søren talked about sense making. All of that relies on judgment, right? But I think it's about being transparent about how those judgments were made, aiming as much as you can for collective processes in that sense making and kind of interrogation, interpretation of data. So it's not just one person making a decision and it sits in their head, but it's in an open and transparent way involving as many different kind of key stakeholders as possible. All of that to me is part of how you demonstrate sort of rigor in how you're working in these ways. And it's having key points at which that is fed into decision-making on an ongoing basis. So it's not just that we collect this data, we do this really great learning, but it sits completely separate to the management and decision-making structures. There have to be identified moments where that feeds directly into decisions that are taken. And I think there should also be some initial assumptions that measurement indicators and methods might need to change as part of that process. And as you learn more about the problems that you're trying to address. Again, this can make people nervous, that, that you're sort of changing what you measure as you go to make yourself look better. But again, if you have a very clear, documented and more transparent trail of why you've made that decision, it can be scrutinized and can be held to account for it. But I think, again, as others have already started to mention, this isn't just about the right sort of tools and methods and processes. It's about the underlying incentives, working cultures, capabilities. We're really talking about rigor, so that these things can actually be operationalized. To me, it's about having wider accountability and reporting processes that reinforce this rather than working against them. So for example, decision makers, wherever they sit, aligning their own reporting and accountability requirements to these processes of testing and learning, rather than simply adding it on as a bit of extra work for people to do alongside everything else that is happening. I think we need to be much more open about the fact that this requires a lot of trust at different levels within teams and across organizations who are collaborating together, so that you can be open about your uncertainties, what's not working, the changes you need to make. So I think we need to recognize that if we're thinking about rigor and how we support it, it's not just about getting a particular tool or method or process right, it's about the wider operating environment as well.
Thank you, Leni, for highlighting that adaptive management is happening, but it might be hidden. And the point is, how do we kind of document this in a transparent way and about making explicit what was implicit. And what you said about culture and incentives, I think it's a key element because that shapes how everybody behaves within the institution. And it's a topic that is very important right now at the IDB as well, because the president of the IDB has been very clear on the importance of promoting a culture to be more focused on results. So Søren, what are your thoughts? Can adaptive management be rigorous?
Thank you, Claudia. I first of all agree with all of Leni's points, and I'll try to initially just be a bit provocative and say, like, again, this depends on what we mean by rigor, right? Is it rigorous to pretend that we can foresee everything that will happen in an initiative upfront, including various risks and opportunities, that we can just make a plan for how to implement it, identify a few preset KPIs, and then we go and implement it regardless of what happens in the real world? You know, is that rigor? Or is it more rigorous to recognize that the world is complex and unpredictable, and you know, to focus on continually making sense of what's happening based on a range of information, qualitative and quantitative, you know, more systematic or anecdotal information, and then to make decisions based on this. And as Leni said, this doesn't mean you're moving the goalpost and that anything goes, but it means that we recognize that we don't know everything up front. Things can change, people can make mistakes, and we need to work in a way that reflects that. And if we do work in that way, then we're able to use our resources more effectively and efficiently. We're able to better manage the risks that might arise and seize opportunities that we couldn't have predicted, and to maximize the impact that we can have. That being said, there are obviously ways of doing adaptive management that can be more or less rigorous and have more or less integrity. And I'll try to complement and not overlap too much with Leni's excellent points, for instance, on the importance of documenting what the adaptation. But a few reflections is, I think, first of all, we need some rigor and be a bit more systematic in how we articulate what it is we want to learn about. Like, how do we articulate learning questions and learning agenda? And who is this for? Like, who is trying to learn here? And who should be part of that conversation? How do we make it more inclusive and really focused on benefiting those that we want to benefit? How do we generate learning? I talked about sense making. That's a very structured process that UNDP is using for systematically extracting learning across a portfolio of interventions and then translating those into action. How often you do this, I think, depends on many factors. Often we see these type of reflection points happen every 6 months, which I think is a useful frequency, but it obviously depends on how much uncertainty that you're facing, how fast things are changing in your context. I think there are also different frequencies maybe for doing reflection and adaptation at different levels of learning. So some people here might be familiar with the terminology of single loop learning, double loop learning, triple loop learning. And, you know, are we simply reflecting on more day-to-day, like how well we implemented particular activities, or are we trying to reflect and adapt on, like, whether our fundamental assumptions in our initiative hold up? We can't question our fundamental assumptions every 3 weeks, but we can have some more light touch, more project management, single loop learning reflection, right? So thinking through, how do we distinguish between maybe different types of learning loops, I think is important and can help add some rigor and not, you know, lead to overkill. For instance, UNDP and the Swedish aid agency SIDA have been working together in North Macedonia, where they had a more light touch, single loop learning type of reflection every month, and then every quarter or every 6 months, they then had a more in-depth collective sense making. And related to the rigor question, I think that is the question of, like, what is good enough data? Because as Leni said, like, you might need some, like, good enough information or timely information at a point that allows you to make decisions. So I think there's a balance there between how rigorous information we look for and what is good enough information to make decisions at a certain point at a certain time. And lastly, I would emphasize rigor in how decisions are made based on learning. Can we introduce processes or templates where we explicitly link certain learning or insights to decisions? And can we clarify like what, who needs to action this, who needs to implement this, and how are they accountable for that? How do we avoid decision-making biases like confirmation bias or what have you? Can we introduce devil's advocate or red teams and so on in some of our governance processes that introduces a bit more rigor when it comes to decision-making? I'll pause there.
Thank you, Søren, for this perspective that, adaptive management can be even more rigorous, like recognizing upfront that we don't know everything at the beginning. And also that this can help size opportunities and defining those processes to link the learning to decision-making and who needs to act on it. It's a key part. So Estelle, from the World Bank Group perspective, how is this being applied and what would be triggered in that case?
Thank you. I kept nodding to everything that Søren and Leni said, because basically, when we did this evaluation, we were very much trying to observe, right? Observe what was happening within country teams, what were their behavior, how did they adapt, and how did they interact with this system, which we ended up finding to be extremely rigid and for the most part unhelpful at the country level. And so I really concur with the fact that there is a lot of hidden or non-explicit or tacit adaptive management that's happening at the country level within project, of course, but that wasn't the object of our evaluation. And some of you might be aware of the work of Dan Honig, who has explored adaptive management quite a lot with his book on navigation by judgment. And that's very much what was happening in those country teams, trying to really leverage as much as possible, these tacit channels, experiences, of course, networks, etc., etc. And so really making these decisions, these judgments based on mostly implicit and tacit knowledge. So they are happening. At the same time, they're happening despite the formal system that is supposed to help those adaptive management decisions and are either unhelpful or sometimes come in the way of these. So let me be a little bit more specific. At the World Bank Group, and many MDBs have kind of had their isomorphic mimicry when it comes to systems. We kind of copy each other. So many MDBs have this kind of system in place as well, anchored very much around this idea of a results framework that is, set out at the beginning of a country engagement cycle, revisited midway, and then ultimately is the basis for a self-evaluation and then a validation from the independent evaluation group where I sit. And within these, there are some formal processes of reporting around these adaptation, right? There was at the bank, there has been a program learning review that happens midway, where it is the opportunity to make some changes to results framework and also to account for the changes that have taken place. So there is this aspect of rigor in terms of trying to be transparent. At the same time, what we found is that those moments, those midterm reflection that are supposed to be for more of this probably second loop learning, we're very much about reporting up and not as much about having this really rethink of a program, of understanding where we are in terms of assessing risks and results, of re-questioning our underlying theories of change. And most of the time was spent trying to run after, team leaders to get an update on their indicators, trying to adjust the targets so that, ultimately the judgment, the rating would be right. And so it wasn't taken, it was crowded out by this reporting system rather than really enabling the type of contestability and really in-depth discussion. So that was quite clear. When it came to the last piece of the cycle, which is this the country learning review, there were really some good instances of taking this opportunity to do a bit more of double or triple loop learning. At the same time, the timing was pretty not aligned with the new country engagement cycle. There was a lot of work that had been done on the country strategy, and then this learning review came a little bit as an afterthought. So there was a bit of stock taking and again reporting up, and not as much useful for the adaptive management decisions that needed to be made at the country level. All in all, there are very motivated staff at the country level who know what they need to change in some ways, and they are working within a system that is not really geared for that and not enabling them to do as much of this. So a lot of the work that the evaluation that I led was about trying to rethink some of these fundamental principles of accountability, incentives, and then ultimately the toolkit, which of course comes after.
Thank you, Estelle, for sharing those findings. And we see those challenges as well at the IDB with the reporting systems and that reporting coming up, but not necessarily being useful for learning and adapting. I'll pass the floor now to my colleague Mariana to continue this very interesting discussion.
So hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you in this discussion as your second moderator. As our panelists just highlighted, the how of adaptive management is often the least documented part, way less than the what and the why, right? And it can only be effectively done with proper evidence to inform decisions. And so as evaluators, it is important to consider how adaptive management impacts our approach to monitoring and evaluation. So I would like to first ask Søren, in what way, if any, M&E needs to change to support adaptive management and maintain a focus on results.
Thank you. I'm obviously biased. I spent a lot of time in this M&E sandbox that was all about rethinking M&E, especially when we work on complex problems. So I think there are a number of ways in which monitoring innovation needs to change, but I think there's also an aspect of, one thing is how to do M&E differently. Another is how do we set our organizations and systems up to enable us to do M&E differently. And I think that's a pain point or headache that many people run into when they begin to put these things into practice, right? And that requires some other skills like change management and internal political, organizational, political, navigation and so on. But maybe putting that aside, but it's just a thing that occurred to me here. But I think M&E needs to change to be designed, or need to be designed to serve three key functions. And I think we need some changes in relation to each of these functions. First of all, as we've already talked about a lot, is that M&E needs to be able to allow us to continuously learn and adapt. Right? This requires a few different things. I think so we already talked about new types of methods and emphasis on learning, and I think Luminate, a philanthropic outfit, is a really interesting example of how they internally scrap traditional performance KPIs and instead focused on like conversations and learning questions and so on. So look into that example if you're interested, because I think the key here is that M&E is not just an accountability compliance reporting function, but making a shift here requires a shift in power. M&E, as I think Estelle was talking about, is quite, top down or extractive. How it's normally done is that people that are doing the work on the ground need to report in all sorts of ways to a principal. So data is fed up to the system, to headquarters or management or what have you. And we need to flip it around. M&E ideally should be about empowering people closest to the problems to be able to continuously learn and adapt what they're doing, because people know what to do and how to get on with it, but we've heard that they're prevented from doing this by existing systems. So we need to kind of rethink that power balance. And I think there's some great examples of organizations that are doing this. Search for Common Ground has been running this youth-led research initiative where it's really focused on empowering local youth to be able to make sense of the reality they live in and how they can navigate that system to create change. That's a very different approach to looking at generation of learning and using that. This links to discussions around decolonizing aid and monitoring and evaluation that I think are really important. So the focus on learning and adaptation, I think that's one key thing, but there's also some changes to other functions. One is about how we track interim progress and report. This is, I think, what a lot of people emphasize when they think about M&E is about reporting and progress tracking and KPIs in the log frame and so on. And I think a key point is that change is a long-term process. And I think there's a question in the chat on this. So we need to know in some way if we're on track in the meantime. But the things we look at to know if we're on track, to be accountable to others and to ourselves, should allow us and incentivize us to learn and adapt. So we shouldn't be accountable for implementing whatever was in our work plan. We should be accountable for adapting and learning and generating change. So we need progress metrics that allow us to adapt, even if change our work plan, that remain relevant, even if we change our work plan and planned outputs and so on. And this is quite a big shift. We've seen organizations introduce things like KPIs that are focused on learning rather than KPIs or outputs that are focused on learning as intermediate results rather than just delivering a report or a workshop or what have you. And the last function I think is important to create some focus on changing is how we understand the wider kind of impact of change. This is a long-term, change is long-term process at sort of really impact level. So how do we measure that? And I think clarifying, are we interested in just understanding, learn about how change is happening out there? Or are we interested in evaluating whether that is good or bad change? And are we interested in measuring our contribution to that change? I think there are different questions to unpack here. Generally, I think we need a shift in framing the focus towards the bigger system out there and where the change is happening rather than what we are doing and whether we are, directly generating change. So it's like this Copernican sort of shift in astronomy where the Earth is not the center of the universe anymore. We need to not look at ourselves as the center of the universe, but look at the bigger system and how we're contributing to change in that. And there are some great organizations that are doing plenty interesting work on that. AZDI VOCA has a really interesting methodology for how they're trying to make sense of bigger changes out there in the system. Lodz Foundation are using rubrics to evaluate whether change in the wider system is good or bad. But I think this cannot be done through traditional KPIs. So this is, again, an area of change. We need to get some more holistic ways of capturing whether change is happening out there, qualitative and quantitative evidence using contribution analysis and stories and so on. And again, there are some great examples, one from the Poverty and Human Development Monitoring Agency in Odisha in India, where they've been deploying a much more human-centric approach to capturing whether change is happening. And I think that is part of the adaptive management discussion, rethinking how we capture and learn about longer-term change and distinguishing between that and more interim progress tracking. I could keep talking, but I'm going to pause here and pass it over to my co-panelists.
Thank you, Søren. I think it's especially valuable to get some examples of how this is happening, how this is being changed in the different organizations. As an anthropologist, I'm biased about reflectiveness, so I'm sold there. But I think also the points you raised about frank, participatory, and constant reflection on what should be measured and why, what for, and also evaluated to allow for learning, and distinguishing between these two types of learning as a purpose, which also connects to the point that Leni raised in the beginning about being very intentional in that exercise, I think are all very valuable. So Estelle, could you tell us a little bit about what should be continued or discontinued in terms of evaluation practices, or any other comments you may have?
Sure. I hope you can hear me well. I had some, yes, okay, great. So what was very clear from, engaging with all of these country teams throughout the evaluation is that, if we propose something different or something new, something else needs to go, right? Because there is, in everything that Leni, Søren, and I have been discussing, it is an intensive approach. It can be a rigorous approach, and it requires collective activities. It requires in-depth analytical work, evaluative work. It requires quite a lot. And so the key question, one of the key questions that the evaluation was trying to answer is, what currently in the systems that we have are not really serving the expected purpose. And so I came back to this point on the results framework, which at the country level, results framework very much have their place in the whole adaptive and results-based management, and they can serve a very good purpose when it comes to interventions that are routine, where we know what works, where the KPIs or the outcome indicators are a really good proxy for what we're trying to achieve, where there is not too much risk of gaming and creaming and all of that, right? So they do serve a purpose, but sometimes they are not the right tool. And so in the report, we try to lay out, in broad strokes, a change in how to think about the array of possibilities when it comes to monitoring, evaluation, and learning. Some organizations are way ahead of the game and have already added many more letters to this acronym. But for us, already trying to distinguish between the purpose of monitoring, evaluating, and learning, and trying to have distinct channels there was something important. So what we try to think about are, monitoring has a very important role when it comes to country portfolios as well. And the frequency of that needs to be adjusted to the kind of decision. So it needs to be focused on the health checks of the portfolio, right? And it needs to be embedded in an IT system that's, iterative enough and user-centered, et cetera, et cetera. The World Bank Group at this point didn't have such kind of system. And the second piece of these monitoring, evaluation, and learning plans was also to have much more decentralized way of thinking about evaluation. In our institution, contrary to UNDP or UNICEF, where there is already, there are some decentralized evaluation function as well. The World Bank Group is very centralized. We have the IG, and then there are self-evaluation reports, but there is less of a culture of having, country teams, country directors, country managers, coming up with evaluative studies that would serve their learning and accountability purpose. So we were trying to also, lay out some of the possibilities for longer-term reflections. Our country engagements are 5-year cycle, but we know that in some sectors, the bank group has been embedded for decades, right? And so having a longer term view of what has happened, how change has taken place at the country level, and how the bank group has contributed to this. So these kinds of evaluative studies are also necessary, mixed methods, etc. And then a major aspect of the proposal was to also have, as Leni had outset, a rigorous learning plan with clear learning questions, clear understanding of the learning gaps, and then some activities to fit these, right? With the understanding that they wouldn't be always very routine, that you know, there needs to be space carved in very already demanding kind of country management tasks, but really dedicated times, dedicated ways of thinking with these you know, red teaming aspects, and kind of also having these mechanisms to question the evidence and to really learn from it. So that was a little bit in broad strokes what we were trying to propose. And so, you know, it's already been 4 years, and I think there has been quite a lot. So these MEL plans haven't been adopted as a recommendation per se, but some of the practices, and when we will talk later around these big principles of changing accountability, what does that mean, the incentive system, some changes have taken place and more are to come with the evolution roadmap of the World Bank Group. We can see that the report has been quite helpful in advancing some of the thinking and getting unstuck from some of the past dependency that we had before.
Thank you so much, Estelle. I think that's very helpful to illustrate already what we should unlearn in a way, and the importance of distinguishing between the purposes of monitoring, evaluation, and learning, as they often are being packaged together nowadays, and how you've been identifying the gaps and addressing them in the World Bank Group. That's super interesting. Leni, what would you add or comment on these perspectives, perhaps coming back to the tacit and under the radar character of adaptation that you mentioned early in the discussion? Curious to hear from you.
Thank you. Yes, I think we are in danger of all agreeing with each other a bit too much, but there's been so many great contributions made from the others, which I'm very thankful for. I'll just maybe add 2 thoughts. One is a bit on kind of methods, and one is on some of those questions about accountability, judgment, etc., that you also flagged, Mariana. So I think in terms of what needs to change for M&E, I think partly we do need to be more sort of clearer that we're often talking about more theory-based approaches in terms of M&E methods when we're talking about these sorts of ways of working. You know, approaches that are concerned not just with saying what happened, but why and how, which are more about measuring contribution to rather than sort of sole attribution. I think that one of the comments in the chat was asking about particular tools. You know, are theories of change better, therefore, than log frames, for example, and how do you make them useful? And I think often theories of change are used as part of adaptive management programs or processes, and they are helpful where they specify pathways for change and spell out assumptions and allow you to kind of measure and test that at different levels. I think not all theories of change currently do that or do it well, and they're often not kept as sort of living documents that are then revised based on what is learned. I often see they're done up front once and kind of left on the shelf. So I think there's a lot we're learning about kind of how to make some of these specific tools, methods, approaches work better. But I've also particularly liked the work by people, evaluators like Tom Aston, Marina Apgar, who've talked about the idea of bricolage, that we shouldn't focus too much on a particular method, approach, tool, but really start to think much more creatively about what is the combination of different things we need to bring together, depending on what it is that's being analysed, you know, the intervention, the portfolio, what kinds of questions do you have, and therefore bring together, you know, in more creative and sort of thoughtful ways, a whole combination of different things that can help you to unpack them. So I would encourage others to look up their work if they haven't already. And then I think on these issues of accountability and judgment, again, I guess I just wanted to underline points that have already come up, that we really do need to recognise that I think the challenge for M&E is it has often been done in a fairly sort of mechanical way, right? It's about collecting data, as others have said, for sort of upward accountability and reporting. But for these sorts of approaches, what we need are those regular spaces where we're interrogating, exploring, making judgments about what the data tells us, and doing that collectively to determine what the implications should be. And I think that means almost starting to put evaluative thinking from the very start as part of whatever it is you're trying to do or achieve, with those frequent processes of reflection and learning, rather than it having been something that you do at the end to work out whether or not you achieved what you wanted to. And I guess one of my big bugbears is that still, I think across almost all of the organizations that I look at and work with, M&E is a separate function, person, unit, team, right? We must integrate it within the decision-making, the program management, whatever, whatever that is in the organization, but within that function. We need to ask, as I said, whether reporting and accountability mechanisms are aligned with M&E. Do those reporting and accountability mechanisms incentivize learning? Is M&E clearly positioned as an internal team function of whatever the unit is, rather than something that is done by someone else or is their responsibility? And I think if we could make that change, it could be, key to unlocking some of this.
I think many points to rescue there, but I'll keep to what you just explained. It's that the importance of being just very clear and explicit about the underlying assumption and causal pathways in our theories of change in a way that supports adaptation based on evidence, and also provides clarity about what changing and adjusting them would be in terms of results, right? However, a closing question remains here. I think one that may be of concern of many in our audience here today. And I'll ask you first, Estelle, what are the implications of adopting adaptive management for accountabilities? And I think we've touched upon that across the discussion, but I would like to focus on that now. And for the incentives in development institutions.
Thank you. Yeah, and so I think it's important that, someone who sits in, who is the guardian of the system, right, in some ways. And that was an important contribution of IAG to say, we realize that we sit on a system that has been built decades ago for, that served their purpose for a while, and now perhaps are really need to be changing, along with some of these core fundamental principles underlying these systems. Accountability has for too long now, I think, and been understood in a much too narrow sense, which for a while was about counting or accounting what has been achieved. The idea that we're accountable for delivering results or delivering outcomes, and that's a bit of a fantasy or a fallacy at this point, because of the complexity that Søren and Leni painted very clearly. So there are a few things that need to change, and this idea also of attribution, right, which is so core in the discourse, but also in how the systems have been built and how the ratings that we are producing are built, which really needs to be challenged, especially at the country level, but more and more so also in projects. So what we try to paint in the report in the last chapter is what kind of switch do we need in those principles. So, we need to re-embrace the principles of Paris 2008, I think, Paris Agreements, right, of mutual accountability. And so the idea is perhaps that, this mutual accountability, collective learning, informed risk-taking, transparency in decision-making, and maintaining trust through this kind of transparency and openness are the key principles that need to underlie these systems. And so moving away from conceiving of accountability as attribution, as meeting certain targets, meeting certain indicators, is really a kind of a key piece. perhaps the system would be better off if country teams were held accountable for providing well-evidenced descriptions of achievements and of failures, for learning from them and from adapting accordingly, not for reaching these indicators that, we're doing a good faith attempt at painting the right one, but sometimes they are not the right one. And also for many things we're aiming for, we don't have good proxies that are measured by indicators, right? And so really also understanding the limitations of that. And then relaxing the focus on metrics, attribution, time-boundedness of these cycles that make sense from an administrative point of view, but not from a change perspective. And is really important as well. So perhaps plausible contribution, adequate evidence-based, time appropriateness, selectivity, as opposed to trying to encompass everything, and then contestability mechanisms for the evidence are things that we would like to see more of. And when it comes to incentives, as I mentioned, it was very, very clear there is so much intrinsic motivation from country teams working, with clients to adapt, to adjust, to have this long-term goal, and we need incentive mechanisms and signals that support this intrinsic motivation, not that comes in the way of that. And that's difficult to change incentives and changing signals. But in the report, we also try to see, in our current processes, procedures, what gets rewarded, what gets noticed. How can we also much more support that motivation for adaptiveness, and take away those aspects that are getting in the way of that. So for instance, we were trying to think about, having meetings that are less, really high level meetings. We have so many that are about, approving a new portfolio, etc. And we could think about higher level meeting, whether it's like at the regional level, etc., around just understanding evidence, discussing, in a portfolio way, a 10-year retrospective. What do we learn from that without necessarily getting into, okay, what's the next business plan, and also in the performance systems of our staff, and ensuring that, delivering and having the financing and disbursements are not the only things that are looked at. We were also thinking about these contestability mechanisms, because there is something to be said about transparency, but there are also needs for safe spaces. And how do you build contestability in that? And so we were thinking about the different kinds of roles and the different kind of skill set that would go into that. So the report goes into more details, but that was the idea of trying to see where the bank group was at that time, and what were these kind of quick wins that needed to be happening, and what could be taken away to stop the crowding out of the inherent motivation that was happening. Yeah.
Thank you, Estelle. I think your reflection on shifting the incentives from merely meeting targets and reporting to creating space for collective learning is especially powerful. I think I especially like your provocation on accountability, maybe leaning towards the learned aspects of lessons learned, right? Teams being accountable for not repeating mistakes and actually learning from what we know already, not pretending that we don't know what we know, as Søren said in one of his articles. Leni, what are your views on this matter, on the balance between accountability and learning?
I think, yes, I think I would underline very much a lot of what Elle said, and I really like the way she captured that point about sort of going back to what we think accountability means, rather than it being about counting what we have achieved, but it's the idea of making an account, right? Explaining how decisions have been taken and why, so that others can scrutinize that, I think is really, really important. I'm conscious of time, so I was just going to maybe add one kind of further reflection into the mix, which is that I think another key change we could make here is to move away. I feel there is so much focus still within MDBs and elsewhere on approval processes, right? All of our time and attention is spent on getting approval, design, perfect upfront. And I think we need to move away from the idea that we can perfectly design things up front and accept that the testing, the learning, adaptation needs to be built in. But that means, if you like, lowering some of the approval bar, but lifting it up for implementation. And I think we haven't got the balance right yet in multiple ways about how we do that. I think that also, as I said, it was about kind of linking these different functions. So, for example, reviewing management and performance incentives so that we are rewarding people at different levels for behaviors that are more likely to lead to effectiveness in this space. You know, program managers, deliverers, implementers can be rewarded for their skills in problem solving, in learning, in adapting based on what has been learned. I think, again, we don't currently reward and incentivize people to be paying attention to those sorts of things. So I think there's, yeah, a couple of things there that I think we could change alongside a lot of the good points that Estelle has already made. Thank you.
Thank you, Leni, and thank you so much for your punctuality. I think you're all being wonderfully punctual. So yeah, changing the culture incentives, of course, are both crucial. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Søren.
Yeah, I'm running the risk of just repeating what's already been said. I think the incentives point is just really important to keep emphasizing. And I think there's an inherent challenge in the sort of tension between measuring something for accountability purposes, because we need to report to someone and our performances and funding or whatever's linked to it, and measuring something because we want to learn about it. Toby Lowe from the Center for Public Impact talks a lot about this, about, you know, when we use a measure for accountability purposes, then all sorts of weird incentives arise to game it, like to hit, you know, if the target is 5 on some KPI, we're just obsessed about like, how do we get to that number 5? And then it stops being useful as an indicator that helps us learn. You know, it corrupts the process it is intended to measure. Like in education, where students and teachers end up training to pass a test rather than like to actually learn, right? And I think that's a tension that is really hard to get around. And I'm still in two minds as to whether it makes sense to have one system that is kind of feeding the beast of the accountability KPIs, and then you have a different thing that's about the learning. And I think at the moment we are still, you know, most people are strapping these systems where they're being asked to do all this new stuff on learning and adaptation, as Leni said, and at the same time, you still have all the traditional reporting things, right? So I don't know whether these can be merged somehow, or if the incentives are just so different that we need to come up with a way to kind of have both, to avoid the accountability measurement kind of corrupting the learning process. And I think an interesting, you know, and I think there's a lot of value in thinking about like learning as a result in itself and being accountable for learning, but it also holds challenges. Again, there's a great example that Tom Aston flags from the Pearl Nigeria program, which is UK funded program in Nigeria, where there was an as part of the log frame, there was there's an output, I think, on learning, and there was even linked to a payment by results mechanism, and that helps increase focus on learning that program. But it also created incentives to like hit whatever that KPI for learning said, rather than actually learning, right? So like it's really hard to get around, and just being very conscious about incentives and what incentives something like a system will trigger, I think is maybe the best solution at this stage. And then lastly, just a reflection, I think there are some other kind of related to the incentives and accountability, some side to also focus on. We often talk about M&E or results-based management, and then independent evaluation is a bit of a kind of a different thing. And if we aren't also focusing on how people, for instance, UNDP colleagues in the country office, my colleagues, they ought to be conscious of, you know, there might be an independent evaluation at the end of the day, and they might not be interested, or the criteria they're using might not be focused on how we adapted, but using other, you know, criteria, right? So making sure there's alignment there, I think, is important. And same with audit. which is another thing. Like people say, yeah, if we get audited though, and we've just been moving funds around and adapting, like how's that going to make us look? So make sure some of these other things that are related and very relevant also enable an environment where we can learn and adapt rather than being punished for course correction. I think it's important.
Yeah, there's a lot of food for thought there. I won't comment because I would like to move to the Q&A part, because I think we have many interesting questions in our Q&A, and by all means, if the participants want to add more questions there. So sadly, at least for me, we're moving to the final part of the event. I will start maybe with the first question from Olivia Mutubazi. That's asking about if adding more bureaucracy to adaptive management would fundamentally undermine its ad hoc nature, instead of increasing the ability of adaptation and empowering them to do so through building trust and following up. So if additional forms, strategies, policies would disempowering, less of empowering. Alternatively, she asks, does adaptive management in this context refer to systematic solutions to systematic problems and not to day-to-day adaptability? I think maybe we could start with Estelle, or if anyone else wants to jump in.
I mean, yeah, yeah, sure, absolutely. Like if you bureaucratize adaptive management, then it's antithetical in some ways. But there are some clear trade-off, right? I mean, I think we also try to lay that out in the report. As Søren just hinted at, there are some important needs that need to be served by a system as well, right? So we can't just dismiss reporting up and being able to also have these more high level, sometimes aggregation at the portfolio level for key shareholders, et cetera, et cetera. So there are multiple needs in our institutions, and somehow we need to kind of meet them all. It is a very interesting thing to ponder. I think for a long time we keep saying, accountability and learning are the two sides of the same coin, maybe not. But so to get back to the question at hand, I think, yeah, the goal is to have systems that are supportive of adaptation and good management practices, don't come in the way of that. But also allow some level of scrutiny, transparency for the learning to happen, for the accountability mechanisms to be able to be valid. There is no magic bullet there, right? So there will be trade-off, and depending on the size of the organizations, depending on the level of scrutiny from outsiders, perhaps the philanthropic space is somewhere where maybe there has been more innovation there as well, because of the different kind of political economy around it. And not every solution that can be working in the philanthropic space would work in an MDB environment. So yeah, it's not over bureaucratizing, but also living with the fact that we are bureaucracies, and for there are some good things about that as well.
Thank you so much, Estelle. Maybe I'll direct one question for each of the panelists so that we have a chance to address more questions. So maybe for Leni, I think the question from Federico Sancho Guevara on regards of timing. So basically he says that impact most times seems something on the long term. So how do we reconcile that with real measurement of impact in such projects? How do we match the timing issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said, I think that there's a few dangers here. One is that we think if we're working adaptively, then we do lots of rapid cycles of testing and iteration, and we focus very much on sort of short-term measures. And I think you do some of that, but you also have to do that kind of longer-term assessments of the extent to which whatever it is you're doing, investing in, is contributing to a broader change process. So in a way, it's that combination of keeping an end goal outcome that it can be somewhat measured, or at least your contribution to it can be, in mind, and tracking that, whilst also tracking your kind of immediate testing and learning you're doing about the pathway to get there. So I think there's a danger here. This isn't either or, it's both, but in different ways. I do just want to comment briefly on Olivia's point as well, because I think in some ways it gets to the heart of some of the things we have just been discussing. And again, my own personal view is we're in a challenging place right now in sort of trying to do both things. As Søren said, like, we feed the beast of accountability and you try to carve out your space for learning. And I completely understand that that's kind of pragmatically perhaps where many different kinds of organizations, institutions are at. But I think there are dangers. What I have seen working very much as an advisor and support to large programs trying to work in this way is that people are actually struggling now under the pressures of meeting all of their kind of traditional accountability reporting requirements and trying to do really great learning, adaptation, and documentation of that. And I think it's not really tenable to say we try to do both, right? I think we have to try to be more radical and to change how we think about accountability, how we construct it, how we approach it within our large development banks, as well as other kinds of organizations. And, you know, let's test and learn and iterate and trial it out and see what works. I actually think Estelle was right that a lot of the experimentation thus far has been at the project level. I think there's more scope perhaps at portfolio level to think about how you shift accountability, because you can think about how you spread your risks, how you balance across your portfolio, perhaps your kind of safer bets and your things that require more adaptation. And perhaps that gives you a bit more flexibility about the menu or the set of options that you're offering in your accountability frameworks. But I think we need to try to do things differently. Otherwise, I worry that adaptive management will kind of continue in this cycle of periodically popping up and then dying away because we can't fully embed it within our ways of working. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Leni. I think the last question for Søren, maybe the one about foresight, because I think you've been working a lot of experimentation. We have the question from Laura Gargiardoni, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced it. She said that she's reflecting on the importance of foresight, especially now with the emerging AI and new technologies and their opportunities, but also risks and costs. So if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, absolutely. On foresight, it's something we've been doing a bit, and I think there's some really useful exercises to think about, like, how do we spot emerging trends and opportunities and risks and so on. That's part of your arsenal for, like, what generates really useful insights that you can use to make decisions on, right? So it makes a lot of sense to integrate that into your sort of measurement, M&E reflection processes. And on the point about the costs and risks and so on, there are obviously many, there's a whole discussion around risk in AI and so on. But one thing I would emphasize is these technologies still don't help get people to use learning to adapt. Like, one thing is generating a lot of insight, another is using it to make decisions, and tech cannot necessarily help us do that. So we might just be focusing a lot on generating all sorts of interesting dashboards and visuals, but how to make sure we use that to make decisions and adapt. I think that's an important point to bear in mind and a risk to consider. I know we have time, so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much. I would like to thank our brilliant panelists for sharing your great insights and very enriching contributions to our understanding of adaptive management and its implications for development. I would like to thank our audience for your participation, and also a heartfelt thank you to our interpretation team, the technical support team, and also our communications team. I think we just briefly summarizing which would be impossible, but I'll try. I think we explored the concepts of adaptive management and its crucial role in navigating the development complexities, emphasizing that it involves fostering a culture of evidence-based adaptation rather than merely collecting data and reporting. I think we discussed a lot the need for rigorous framework that support continuous learning and real-time decision making, making monitoring and evaluation more dynamic and focus on adaptation. We discussed the importance of having an enabling environment where staff have the capacity, the incentives, and the authorization to act on evidence, recognizing and supporting adaptation efforts. And we also heard different viewpoints on implementing adaptive management in various contexts, the importance of tailoring it to context, on the to the context of specific organizations and the situations, right? So now I'll pass the floor to Claudia to officially close our event.
Yeah, and now very briefly that I think this discussion also leaves us evaluators with a huge task on how do we push for new ways of doing things? How do we rethink accountability? And also recognizing that from the evaluation part, we also generate incentives. So stay connected and keep up with our future events. Please follow Ove on LinkedIn and Twitter. We will be sharing the recording in a few weeks. So thank you, everyone in the audience. Thank you to our panelists for such an amazing discussion.
Thank
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank you. Bye.